Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Morning. This week we turn to look at a remarkable woman of the 16th century, Saint Teresa of Avila, Doctor of the Church. Actually, she was the first to be so named as a Doctor of the Church with, remember the woman we explored last week, St. Catherine of Siena. They were both named to that dignity together by Pope St. Paul VI in 1970. And remember, just to sort of recap something I mentioned last week, that it was Pope St. Paul VI who was the innovator in this. He was the first Pope to formally recognize the teaching authority of women in the Church. And so now we have 4 female doctors out of the 36 doctors of the Church. And next week we'll be talking about, we're going to double down because it's the last session of this series. And so next week we'll double down and talk about St. Teresa of Lisieux and also St. Hildegard of Bengal, who's an 11th century mystic. So we'll finish this series up next week. Now, one of the things that I hope to sort of go back and give a big idea of the whole series before we jump in to talk about St. Teresa today is that one thing I hope that everyone has seen over the course of these last, this is the 12th week, is that the writings and influence of every single individual we've talked about are timeless. And that's one of the reasons, one of the criteria, obviously, for them to be a doctor of the Church, is that they have a lasting, profound influence, some significant intellectual contribution to the faith that is lasting. And I think, I thought about this as I was thinking about St. Teresa all week, getting ready for this, that and she certainly had a profound influence in my personal life. So I will say that. Greg LaRue and I were talking about this right before we started today, that of all the people of this era, particularly in the Church, the great age of mysticism, she is one that is profoundly influential on so many people. And it is because it is a kind of a practical mysticism, for lack of a better word. It's a practical mysticism, but all of these people, not just the woman we're talking about today, but all of them as doctors of the Church speak to eternal and timeless truths, and that's the reason they are doctors. It's not because they're writing about things that are situational in the Church at the time that they live, or things that might be passing away. They're writing about things that are eternal, and that is, of course, at the very essence of what the Church recognizes when they elevate someone to this dignity of Doctor of the Church. St. Teresa of Avila was a Carmelite nun, a great reformer. She had a great zeal for reform. Remember, I said she's 16th century, so she's living during an age of great upheaval in the Church. She was very active. We tend to think about mystics as being contemplative and quiet. But as you learn more about St. Teresa, yes, that's one aspect of her, but the other aspect of her is that she walked into a room, she was the biggest thing in the room. She would light up a room. She had a very gregarious, outgoing personality. She's been called by many of her contemporaries as a great light. She was a bright light. And so we've got these two aspects of her. So we tend to think about people who are mystics as being maybe more withdrawn or contemplative and quiet. And she certainly had that. But she was also quite active, very zealous during a movement we call the Catholic Reformation, the true Reformation, right? The Reformation of the Church that happens in the 16th century, largely the result of the calling of the Council of Trent. And so yes, she has that. But she is also, of course, one of the greatest mystics in the history of the Church. Last week, we explored the meaning of that word, mystic, the concept of it last week when talking about the visions of St. Catherine of Siena. And this is a gift, the gift of visions. This is a gift that St. Teresa shares as well. Her writings are among some of the most profound mystical literature, and I'm not understating this, some of the most profound mystical literature that we have to this day in the Church. As I am sometimes want to do, I want to begin with a favorite story of mine about her. And it's actually a story that has come down in the tradition, in the oral tradition of the Carmelite order. You don't find this story in any of the first-hand accounts. Well, that's not true. we find a portion of the story in a first-hand account. The Life of Teresa, actually, she wrote an autobiography. But she doesn't tell us the rest of the story. The end of the story comes from the tradition of the Carmelite order, and it actually, I think, underscores not only the essence of her personality. I think it captures very well, but it also illustrates her profound faith in God. So this actually is a story that takes place at the end of her life. So I'm going to begin there, and trust me, I'll circle back around and make this work. But it is a story that is obscure. As I said, the ending of it is obscure in that it's come down to us as tradition only. All right, so the story relates, I think, an all-too-human aspect of her that we can all relate to. Her emotional honesty, I think. I've said this about many of these people. One of the things that always attracts us to individuals is their ability to be honest, and you sense that in them. And she's just out there with it. Very much out there with it. And very much on display in this story, as well as her sense of humor, which she was also quite noted for. So, it is reported to have happened in the year 1582, the year that she died, when she left Avila on a journey to undertake she was actually going to oversee the establishment of some new convents, 2 new convents, at the end of her life, where she was caught in the midst of a flood. And I'm going to let her words tell the first part of the story. She said, quote, "We had to run many dangers. The rivers were so high that the water in places covered everything. Neither road nor the smallest footpath could be seen, only water everywhere, and 2 abysses on each side. It seemed foolhardiness to advance, especially in a carriage, for if one strayed ever so little off the road, which was invisible, one must have perished. Indeed, some did." And she ends it there. She ends the story there. The flood that she described actually took place in that year 1582 near Burgos in northern Spain, which, as I said, she was traveling to. She does not relate any more about her adventure, but the rest of the story comes down to us again from this oral tradition of the Carmelites, who tell us this. And this is supposedly comes from one of her companions on that day. One of her companions related that, seeing their fear, St. Teresa turned to them with encouragement and said, "Since we are engaged in God's work, how could we die in a better cause?" She then led them forward through the flood. She was on foot. The current was so strong that she was swept away a couple of times. At the end of the day, she was exhausted, soaking wet, drenched in mud, and probably more than a little bit traumatized. I mean, you can imagine that she would have been. Her sisters reported that she said, after she'd gone to have one of her conversations with Jesus, which, of course, is something we'll be talking about. She's reported to have said, "Lord, why do you put such obstacles in my path?" And that St. Teresa reported that the Lord responded to her with, "Do not complain. I watch over you, for you are among my friends." And there's a few different versions of how this has been reported. And St. Teresa famously answered Jesus with a bit of a retort. She said, quote, "If this is how you treat your friends, Lord, it is no wonder you have so few of them." And I love that story because it really captures to me the essence of who she was. Just honest and on a journey and all too human, right? All too human. So, I mean, who among us has not had a time when maybe we couldn't relate to that, truthfully? The year she was born, 1515, to put this in some context, was just 2 years before Martin Luther penned his famous 95 Theses against the sale of indulgences that sparked a firestorm in Christianity, which he may or may not have, by the way, famously nailed to the door of the church in Wittenberg. I don't know how many of you know this, but I'm going to digress for just a second, because I would tell my students this. We always hear that Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of his church. Have y'all all heard that?
Yes.
We don't know that. The only reason we suppose that is because that's the way that people commonly distributed information in the 16th century, is that you would publicly post something. But we actually don't have that in a record that he did that. He may have passed it out. He may have laid it in the vestibule of the church. I mean, we don't know that he nailed it to the door, but I'm always reminded of that when I hear that story. I have to always want to qualify that to you and say, well, now we don't know that he really nailed it, but certainly it's the year that he published it. And it was dated, of course, October 31st of 1517. And this action, this protest, which is, of course, where our word Protestant comes from, this protest sparked a firestorm across Europe. As Luther's movement gained speed, and then once he was excommunicated, Luther's movement splintered into many different factions. Eventually, of course, today, in many, many factions. By the time St. Teresa entered the Carmelite order as a young woman in 1536, the Protestant movement was well underway across Europe. The German provinces, Switzerland, by 1536, it had even crossed the Channel into England, where just 3 years before, 1533, King Henry VIII famously broke from Rome with his act of supremacy and took the title of Supreme Head of the Church of England. And so she's coming into the Carmelite order in a very turbulent era. In her homeland of Spain, St. Teresa would have been somewhat insulated from this movement, and I'll tell you why. It's really interesting that when the Protestant movement breaks out, it's no surprise to me, actually, that it happens in the Holy Roman Empire, in those German states, because there's no strong sense of unity there. You've got, dozens of little principalities that are all ruled by local nobles or local princes, and the Holy Roman Emperor, depending on who it is and at what point in history, may or may not exert a lot of centralized control or authority. So it's no surprise that you would have a protest that would begin there, that would spread very quickly and would also divide, because that's sort of the nature of that nation state. Okay? The reason you don't see the Protestant movement in Spain, well, obviously it was the land of the Inquisition. We're going to talk about that in a minute. You don't see it in Spain, you don't see it in France, because you do have by this time, very strong, centralized, consolidated monarchies that will drive religious policy. Even in England, where you have this break with Rome that happens in 1533, the Protestant, for lack of a better word, and I'm not sure that's the right one, but the Protestant movement in England is going to look very different than the one that happens in Germany, because of the differences in monarchy. The one in England is always going to be driven by the monarch. So, back to my point that you don't see in France or in Spain you don't see the Protestant impact immediately. Certainly this is true in Spain, in her homeland of Spain, where she would have been insulated from it, because the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, uniquely under the control of the Spanish monarchy, had been active since the time of Ferdinand and Isabella, when they united the houses of Castile and Aragon by marriage in 1469. They had, as part of that process of consolidation, the Inquisition operated there specifically to Christianize the Iberian Peninsula. Because at the time that Castile and Aragon were united with their marriage, in the late 15th century, the Iberian Peninsula was home to a population of Jews, Muslims, and Christians who all were living there together. And to Christianize the peninsula meant, of course, that the Inquisition would insist upon the conversion of those who were non-Christians, or they had to leave. They had to leave Spain. So if you understand that background, then you know that there's not going to be many Protestants in Spain, right? There's not going to be many Protestants who want to be in Spain. She knew well the consequences of this. As a matter of fact, her own grandfather was a converso. Her own grandfather was a Jew who had been forced to convert to Christianity to retain his business and his trade and his estates under Ferdinand and Isabella, and who obviously it was either convert or leave. So this was the choice that was given to Jews. Now, Teresa's father and her mother was actually the second wife of her father. They appear to have been, of course, devout Christians, particularly her mother. And Teresa's father was a very successful merchant who became quite wealthy, and as far as we can tell, as I said, was truly a practicing Christian. Although there is some doubt among her biographers if her grandfather ever truly converted to Christianity, but I will leave that. We know that he was summoned for the Inquisition more than once. So there's some question there. Because the Spanish Inquisition was this powerful cultural and religious force in Spain, she probably had, in these very early days, had very little contact with or perhaps exposure or understanding of Protestant theology or literature. But of course, she became aware of it. She had to have become aware of it as the church called its own Reform Council at Trent in 1545. She would be a major voice of reform during that period, particularly within her own sphere of influence, which was the Carmelite order, and did not hesitate to use her voice to speak on other matters as well. Her hometown of Avila is in northern Spain, central Spain, is a medieval fortress. It is I think a really culturally significant site to this day, because of its unique architecture, the overwhelming nature of the architecture. The city itself has this great, rich tradition of church building. As a matter of fact, sometimes it's called the town of stone and saints, and it's called that because it built more churches in the Middle Ages than most comparable cities its size, the sheer number of churches. She grew up immersed in this very deep, rich Catholic culture in central Spain. Perhaps one of the most transformative events of her young life was the loss of her mother. When Teresa was a child, she was about 10 or 11, depending on which source you read. And it was apparently then that she developed her very strong devotion to the Virgin Mary as her spiritual mother, and seeking solace and comfort, but probably a replacement for, in many ways, the mother she had lost. She received a very good education. Again, I want to go back and highlight something we talked about with St. Catherine of Siena, who was literate in the 14th century, quite unusual for a woman to be literate in the 14th century. And it is because of her religious life that she had that. It is still uncommon, even in the 16th century. We've come forward, 150 years now from St. Catherine of Siena, but it's still very unusual for women to receive the kind of education that St. Teresa did. And she entered the Carmelite order at the age of 21. So, like St. Catherine of Siena, she also engaged in mortification of the flesh that were, in her case also, sometimes, especially in the early part of her life, quite extreme. One such occasion leaving her incapacitated and bedridden for several months, according to her own account of her life. She did so, this mortification of the flesh, extreme fasting, eating for prolonged periods of time, eating only small amounts of bread and water, and she would lose her physical strength, and then she would be chastised by her spiritual advisor to eat properly. It's sort of a similar cycle we saw with St. Catherine of Siena. But she did this in parallel with her study of contemplative prayer and how to achieve a state of communion, a deep state of communion with God in a transcendent state. What she called religious ecstasy. And actually the term religious ecstasy is one that has come down as a proper term now. Technically speaking, this is an altered state of consciousness where everything that is physically discernible in your reality is minimized. The physical reality, with the external to you, is minimized, greatly reduced awareness of that, and a greatly increased awareness of the mental and spiritual state. And this is, of course, what she is noted for in her writings we're going to talk about. In St. Teresa's case, these states were accompanied by visions, which she reported and recounted frequently. This state of ecstasy is depicted in many beautiful artworks across the centuries of St. Teresa. This is one of mine. Well, I like this one very much, the one I have here. But I also like very much Bernini's sculpture, The Ecstasy of St. Teresa, which is based on a 1559 vision that she had, where she described an angel piercing her heart. And sometimes some people think that this particular version's been heavily criticized for being somewhat eroticized. I'll return to this version, painted by Fontevasco, which is a little less so. To frame her a little more in context, let's talk about some of what might have been her spiritual influences. You think about this rich 16th century and all that was going on. Who might have been her spiritual influences, the people that she drew upon for the great work that she did? Certainly she would have been familiar with the great mystical traditions of the Middle Ages. To what extent she may have known of St. Catherine of Siena, we have only hints of. But a woman that we're going to talk about next week is Hildegard of Bengal, who is from the 11th century. And we're almost certain that St. Teresa would have been influenced by her. She was somewhat a contemporary of St. Ignatius of Loyola. He was born in 1491. She was born in 1515. Both born in Spain. So he was 24 years old, did I make it right, when she was born. He received his life-changing battle wound, St. Ignatius did, in 1521, when she was a child, or just 6 years old. But she may have crossed paths at some point later in her life with his spiritual exercises. It's been suggested that she was influenced by that. At some point before she died in 1582, he published his spiritual exercises in 1548. So I think that's quite likely that she would have been aware of that. Most certainly she knew of him. Most certainly she knew of him. He founded the Jesuit order in 1541, and then they were allowed to expand, the Jesuits were allowed to expand in numbers significantly after the Council of Trent, when the Jesuits showed up as great defenders of the papacy and great defenders of the church during that Reformed Council. So she most certainly had to have known of him, obviously. And one of her sort of the middle of her life, one of her spiritual directors, she has several throughout her life. One of them was a Jesuit, so certainly she was aware of St. Ignatius. She relates directly, though, that she was influenced by St. Augustine and his Confessions, which she claims to have read many times. She said that in his Confessions, she was able to see her own wretchedness, and once she had, then she was free to contemplate God more directly and with even greater fervor, she relates. She also had what is called, we're talking about the gift of visions, she also had what is called the gift of tears. Y'all ever heard of this? And sometimes it's called the blessing of tears. You won't find it in Scripture, you don't find it in the Catechism. But it is something that is reported by so many of these great figures of the faith, it's also considered a mystical gift. That when someone has a close encounter with God that results in the overflowing of tears, and I, I often wondered about this. Some people have an overwhelming sort of reaction to natural settings, for instance, to simply have tears flow freely and inexplicably in the presence of something beautiful. That's sort of perhaps one manifestation of this. And as I said, I've often wondered about this myself because I have had the tendency to do this sometimes. But the difference is that in a person who truly has this gift is that there's no sobbing involved, right? It's simply the tears flowing inexplicably. And this is noted by many of her contemporaries to have this. They are unnatural, again, in that they simply flow. And there is no stopping them, would be a better way to say it. Like other spiritual gifts, the gift of tears, as St. Teresa writes about herself, they are meant for the edification of others. So it's not something that she would have experienced necessarily in a room by herself. She would experience, and her contemporaries write about it. So she would experience these visions always in the presence of other people. She would experience these tears always in the presence of other people. And it was meant for their edification, she tells us. Another great influence on her good friend was St. John of the Cross, another doctor of the church. Some of you may know him. He's best known for his work, Dark Night of the Soul. Theirs was a most unconventional, and some would say unusual, friendship for sure. She was 52 and he was 25 when they met. And she was actually establishing new convents. He was a newly ordained Carmelite priest. And they worked together to reform the orders themselves, worked within the orders to reform, to bring about what they saw as sort of a laxity that had fallen into place by the 16th century. He was certainly both influenced by her mystical spirituality as much as she was influenced by his. The Carmelite history, as I said, records theirs as the most holy friendship, but full of what they call, quote, great joy and respect in each other's company and in each other's talents. In the history of the order that I'm referring to, much is made about comparing their personalities. So this is what I think is interesting that I mentioned before. This comes from the history of the order. Quote, she was animated, chatty, and witty. She took energy from being in the presence of others, the Carmelite sisters say. His manner was more reserved, gentle, unnoticed. But when called upon, he was quite capable of exercising leadership and good management. So we have this sense of sort of a symbiotic kind of relationship that they enjoyed, of course, obviously for many years until her death in 1582. Teresa appreciated in John the richness of his deep interior spirituality. She writes about this. And that not long after they met, she selected him as her own spiritual director and later requested him to be the confessor for her convent. They had the same goals and the same outlook on the church. So besides visions, these periods of ecstasy and holy tears, St. Teresa, as I said, also said she engaged in this mortification of the flesh, which ran in parallel to these other gifts that she had. One of her earliest spiritual directors, the Jesuit I mentioned, was actually Francis Borgia. Yes, Borgia. He was a great-grandson of Pope Alexander VI, the most corrupt pope in history, Rodrigo Borgia. He gave her some guidance about this and apparently strongly intervened rather forcefully with her about this practice, particularly after the bout that nearly killed her. And St. John of the Cross was even more strict with her, apparently, about this, insisting that she stop taking such extreme measures that she had been known for in her youth. And I mention that because, like Catherine of Siena, although St. Teresa lives longer, this certainly contributed to sort of ongoing health problems. Certainly contributed to that. I mentioned that she was a zealous reformer. Remember that I said this was the age of the Catholic Reformation. The Catholic Reformation. The Reformation of the Church that took place, not the Protestant movement, the Catholic Reformation that took place in the 16th century. She became aware of the abuses and laxity of practice within her own order. She didn't have to look very far to see it. And this became a source, like we saw with St. Catherine, this became a source of great consternation for her. It was something that she could not let go of once she was aware of it. There were so many visitors in the convent that she wrote about this. What is the point of living in a cloister if you're going to open it up? What is the point? And she commented about this frequently. This moved her to found a Reformed Carmelite convent, the first of 17 that she would establish throughout Spain, that had a much more rigid rule of life, certainly was less worldly. They were less worldly in their orientation. The cloister meant a cloister. Now, not unexpectedly, human nature being what it is, I guess you can imagine what might happen next. Others in the order viewed this quite negatively, viewed her rather negatively, and launched some, what must have been quite hurtful, personal attacks against her, impugning her character, so much so that eventually the King of Spain himself got involved. The King of Spain at this point in time being Philip II. She had written to him, actually, when someone made allegations, actually wanted to bring charges against her before the Spanish Inquisition about her being bewitched because of her visions, because of her incredible spiritual gifts. And so she wrote to him, sort of as an apology, it's a defense letter, and he responds to her that she doesn't need to defend herself, that everyone knows who and what she is. She's very well respected. The King of Spain knew her name. Pope Gregory XIII weighed in on her behalf as well. He even went so far as to issue an edict recognizing her reformed order, while King Philip II was simultaneously issuing secular decrees that were protections, designed to be protections for her and her order. So we get the sense that she was someone not only quite well known in her lifetime, but obviously quite well respected. And maybe some of this is because she was of noble birth, maybe, and of noble, wealthy birth, perhaps. But yes, but she was also this is because of the time we're talking about. The Great Reform Council of 1545 to 1562 was well underway, and she was a well-known religious. Clearly, it speaks to the fact that even during her life, her piety and her zeal were evident to people in authority. People knew this about her. So she lived to see, as I said, she lived to 1582. So she lived to see the great reforms that many of them which were instituted because of the new dogmatic constitutions that came out of the Council of Trent. She lived to see much of that by the time she died in 1582. And she died, interestingly, she died at 67, so she lives longer, obviously, twice as long as St. Catherine of Siena. But she died in 1582, and what's interesting about this year is that she died in October, and it was just as Europe was making the shift from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. Okay? So what this means is that there's, to modify the calendar, there's a loss of days. And this is not really pertinent to this part of the story, but I'm going to give you a more extreme example, is that England, of course, Britain didn't adopt the Gregorian calendar until the 18th century. And when they did, they lost like 14 days Like you go to sleep on September 1st and wake up on September 15th. So the same thing goes on with the modification of the calendar right around the time, actually falling on the day that St. Teresa died. So the excision of the dates of the calendar, October 5th through the 14th, those dates are not on the calendar, 1582. So she died either right before midnight on October 4th or early in the morning of 15 October, depending on which calendar you're on. But October 15th is, of course, celebrated as her feast day. So, and obviously, because it was the shift to the Gregorian calendar, the excision of those dates, had she died on October 5th, which was no longer on the calendar, it wouldn't have mattered because according to the liturgical calendar then in use, obviously, she died on the 15th in any case because it was the Gregorian reform that changed the calendar. So, October 15th. Her last words were recorded by the Carmelite sisters who say that she was her upbeat and joyous self till her very last breath. And she said, quote, "My Lord, it appears it is time to move on. Well then, may your will be done. The hour that I have longed for has come. It is time for us to meet one another now." Now, to her writings, of which there are many, a portion of Interior Castle is reprinted in your reader, just enough to sort of whet your appetite or your interest, I hope, in reading more of it. I obviously could not print the entire thing. You get some sense of that. She also wrote another great work, well, several really, but another one that I highly recommend, that I also enjoy. And incidentally, I have read Interior Castle probably, I don't know how many times in my life, but another one of hers that I go back and reread frequently, or portions of, is called The Way of Perfection. And her autobiography also, I could highly commend, it's called The Life of Teresa. You get a great sense of her personality and her personal spirituality, her personal piety, her personal approach to the faith. A lot of details about her come out in her autobiography. Although I have to tell you, there's parts of Interior Castle that I read today and I laugh. And it's supposed to be a mystical work, but it's because the essence of her personality comes out. As she describes this, the mansions of your mind that you can contemplatively work through to achieve the deepest possible state of prayer and communion with Christ. She also composed poetry. She wrote meditations on sacred scripture, and she loved the Song of Songs, for instance, and wrote a really beautiful meditation on that. So when you think about, what her greatest legacy is to us, and it's very hard to narrow it down. Certainly, the mystical literature is significant. As I said, Interior Castle is a how-to practical guide. It is very practical. To wrap back around again to what I said here at the beginning, the intellectual contributions of all these people who are doctors of the church is that their work is timeless. Interior Castle you can read in any age. The Way of Perfection you could read in any age. And it's going to speak to you the same way it would speak to any Christian living in any age of the church. It is the chief characteristic of why they are doctors of the church. Eternal truths from an eternal perspective. And then, of course, in the case of St. Teresa, you get these wonderful glimpses of her personality that are thrown in there too, as we did with St. Augustine, remember, in Confessions, as we did with St. Jerome in his letters, as we did with St. Gregory Nazianzen in his letter. You get glimpses of their personality, which makes them real people to us. One of the things I really appreciate about her, as I said, is that she is so real. Now, on a personal note, I did not know this, of course. I was 18 years old when I came to the faith, and I didn't know very much about figures of Christianity, and had only just begun really to learn about the saints. But have you ever heard the expression that your confirmation saint chooses you? Have you ever heard that? that you might think about, well, who's the person that I most identify with? Well, I didn't know. I knew so little. I was unchurched, really, as a child, mostly unchurched, and I knew very little about the faith when I first came to it. And so I thought, well, I need a really strong female figure who knows a lot about the faith, somebody who's done this. And so without knowing very much about her, and having not really read her yet, I mentioned to the Dominican that I had done private catechesis with, I said, I'm really sort of leaning towards St. Teresa of Avila. He was like, oh yes, absolutely. And he gave me a copy of Interior Castle, which I didn't read for several years. But what's interesting is now to be at this point in my life, to be looking back on my own journey of faith and to see that once I picked up Interior Castle and I read it, and then I read other works of hers, and I came to feel such an intense sort of kinship with her. It's remarkable that she chose me. She chose me to be my confirmation saint. A truly remarkable woman, inspiring in every single way. She truly, truly is. So next week we're going to conclude the series, Voices of the Church. In case you thought it was never going to end. It ends next week. We're going to be doubling down, as I said, with St. Teresa of Lisieux and St. Hildegard of Bengal. We're going to double down with those two, the other two female doctors of the church. So until then, thank you for coming. Thanks for watching. Thanks for those of you I know will be watching later. And everyone stay well and be happy. And please enjoy a blessed Advent. Thank you.